Every empire that tried to destroy the Jewish people accidentally preserved their DNA. And in 2010, scientists finally ran the test that proved it. What they found inside those genomes rewrites everything you thought you knew about identity, blood, and survival. Did you already know DNA could trace ancestry this far back? Or does this surprise you? Drop a comment below. Babylon tried to erase them. Rome tried to scatter them. Spain burned them at the stake. Eastern Europe massacred entire towns. And every single time, the world said, "This is the end." But here is the thing that no history book properly explains. Every empire that tried to destroy the Jewish people accidentally preserved their DNA. And in the year 2010, scientists finally ran the test that proved it. Dr. Harry Oster, a medical geneticist at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York, collected DNA from 237 Jewish people across the world's biggest diaspora communities: Morocco, Iraq, Iran, Italy, New York. He then compared that DNA against nearly 2,800 non-Jewish people from 40 different countries. The result? Jewish people from Morocco and New York, who had been separated by oceans and centuries, were genetically closer to each other than they were to the non-Jewish neighbors they had lived beside for hundreds of years. Dr. Oster wrote in his findings, "We have shown that Jewishness can be identified through genetic analysis." He called it, and I want you to really hear this, the demographic miracle. A people scattered across every continent on Earth, persecuted for 3,000 years. Demand their DNA stayed together. Now, before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you watching this from? And have you ever taken a DNA ancestry test, like 23andMe or Ancestry DNA? What did it show you? Because by the end of this video, you are going to look at your own ancestry in a completely different way. Now, the question nobody is asking is this: how? How does a genome survive 3,000 years of exile, massacre, and forced conversion? To answer that, we have to go back, way back, not 3,000 years, 10,000 years, to a land that no longer exists on any modern map, and to a group of people who left behind the oldest genetic archive in human history. Around 10,000 years ago, in the region we today call Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, a group of early farmers settled the land. They built villages, they grew crops, they traded with neighbors. Scientists call this region the Levant. And when researchers extracted ancient DNA from burial sites in this region, something unexpected happened. These ancient Levantine people were already genetically different from their neighbors in Egypt and Mesopotamia, a unique branch of humanity rooted in one specific corner of the world. Dr. Doron Bahar, an Israeli geneticist who led a landmark study published in the journal Nature in 2010, stated directly, "The most simple explanation for what we found is a common genetic origin, consistent with Jewish people descending from ancient residents of the Levant. Now here is the detail that changes everything. These ancient people had a habit. They married within their own community. Generation after generation after generation. Scholars call this endogamy. And what endogamy does, biologically, is act like a time capsule. It locks the original genetic code in place. It slows down the mixing that normally erases ancient lineages over hundreds of years. So while civilizations rose and fell all around them, this Levantine genome stayed remarkably intact. Think of it like a river that flows through 10,000 years of history without losing its original water. Yeah, but then, in 586 BCE, a Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar did something that should have stopped that river completely. He marched his army into Jerusalem, burned the temple, and forced the entire Jewish population, in chains, 900 miles away into exile. What happened next defied every known pattern of human history. Here is a pattern that historians have documented across dozens of ancient civilizations. When a people are conquered and moved by force, within 2 to 3 generations, they dissolve into the new culture. They take new names. They forget their language. They disappear. It happened to the Assyrians who conquered Israel in 722 BCE. It happened to dozens of other peoples swallowed by Babylon. But the Jewish exiles in Babylon did something no conquered group had ever done before. They sat down, and they wrote everything. They finalized the Torah. They created the synagogue, a portable place of worship that needed no land and no temple. They built an identity so complete, so portable, so carefully preserved, that it could survive anywhere on Earth. And the DNA confirms it. Genetic studies of Jewish communities in Iraq, the very land of ancient Babylon, show a core Levantine ancestry that barely mixed with the local Mesopotamian population, even after living there for 2,500 years. Professor Neil Risch, director of the Institute for Human Genetics at the University of California, San Francisco, published research showing that certain genetic mutations in the Jewish population have been present for approximately 120 generations. He traced these mutations back to, and I quote, around the time that the Jewish people formed as a distinct population in the Middle East. That is not a cultural story. That is a biological timestamp. And if you look closely at modern Jewish DNA, scientists can even find a faint genetic signal from the Persian period, a small trace from the time when the Persian king Cyrus the Great freed the Jewish exiles and allowed them to go home. A ghost in the genome, left behind by one of history's most famous acts of mercy. But just when the Jewish people rebuilt their city and their temple, a new threat arrived. Not an army, an idea. And this one nearly worked. The year is 332 BCE, when Alexander the Great conquers the Levant. And unlike every conqueror before him, Alexander doesn't just bring soldiers. He brings gymnasiums, Greek philosophy, Greek names, Greek fashion, and it works. Wealthy Jewish families in Jerusalem start giving their children Greek names. They stop practicing certain rituals. They attend Greek cultural events. For the first time in history, Jewish identity was not being destroyed from the outside. It was being chosen away from the inside. And the DNA shows it. Traces of Greek and Macedonian ancestry appear in some Jewish populations from this era. But here is the twist. Those traces are completely absent in other populations. The community was splitting into those who blended and those who refused. That split exploded into open conflict in 167 BCE. A Jewish priest named Mattathias and his sons, the Maccabees, launched a revolt. Not just against Greek armies, but against the Jewish families who had chosen to assimilate. And after 3 years of fighting, they won. The families that had fully merged into Greek culture disappeared from Jewish genetic lineages within a few generations, absorbed, gone. The families that resisted, their DNA became the foundation of every Jewish community that came after. And the celebration of that victory? It survives today, every year, in homes across the world. When a family lights the Hanukkah menorah, they are lighting a flame that was first lit 2,200 years ago. A flame that represents a moment when a people chose their identity and their genome over comfort and acceptance. But the Greeks failing only meant one thing. Rome was next. And Rome was going to do something far more devastating than any Greek philosopher. Rome was going to scatter the Jewish people to every corner of the known world. And the genome, that ancient, preserved, carefully protected genome, was about to fracture across 3 continents. The year is 70 CE. His Roman general Titus leads his legions into Jerusalem. The Second Temple, the holiest site in Jewish history, is completely destroyed. And if you go to Rome today, you can still see it. The Arch of Titus, built to celebrate this conquest, still stands in the Roman Forum. On its carved stone walls, you can see Roman soldiers carrying the temple menorah through the streets of Rome in triumph. A monument to destruction that has stood for almost 2,000 years. After this, the Jewish people split into 2 major streams: Ashkenazi Jews, moving north and west into Central and Eastern Europe; Sephardic Jews, spreading south through North Africa and the Mediterranean. 2 groups, 2 completely different worlds, separated for nearly 2,000 years. Now, if a genome normally mixes and changes with its surrounding population after just a few generations, what do you think happened after 2,000 years? Here's what Dr. Shahari Ostrer found in his 2010 study. Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews, despite nearly 2,000 years of separation, shared a common Levantine genetic core that was unmistakably traceable. They were still genetically closer to each other than to the European or North African populations they had lived among for centuries. Dr. Ostrer said, and this line is important Ashkenazi Jews were as closely related to each other as typical fourth or fifth cousins. I mean, every single Ashkenazi Jew on earth, a distant cousin of every other. But then, in November 2022, researchers from Hebrew University of Jerusalem and Harvard Medical School did something extraordinary. They excavated teeth from a medieval Jewish cemetery in Erfurt, Germany. The teeth were 700 years old. They extracted DNA from 33 individuals, and what they found was shocking. 1/3 of all the people buried in that cemetery shared the exact same mitochondrial DNA, the same maternal line. The meaning, 1/3 of an entire medieval city's Jewish community descended from a single woman who had lived somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years before them. Professor David Reich of Harvard Medical School, one of the world's leading ancient DNA scientists, noted in the study, an intermarriage rate with outsiders of more than 1 in 500 per generation would have shifted Ashkenazi ancestry by an amount we could detect. But that didn't happen. But that's new information. Let that sit for a moment. 1 in 500 for over 25 generations in medieval Europe. That level of genetic separation, in one of the most diverse and chaotic periods of human history, is almost without explanation, unless you understand what came next. Because this bottleneck, this massive narrowing of the Ashkenazi gene pool, led scientists to a debate so explosive, so politically charged, that it reignited a 1,000-year-old question. Are Ashkenazi Jews even descended from the ancient Israelites at all? In 1976, a writer named Arthur Koestler published a book called The 13th Tribe. His argument, Ashkenazi Jews are not descended from ancient Israelites. They are descended from the Khazars, a Turkic empire in the Caucasus region that reportedly converted to Judaism in the 8th or 9th century CE. The book became one of the most controversial pieces of historical writing in the 20th century. For some people, it was an attempt to disprove the ancestral connection of Ashkenazi Jews to the ancient Levant. For some academics, it was a serious historical theory that deserved examination. For the scientists, it became a question that demanded a clear answer. And in 2010, the answer came. Dr. Harry Oster's genome-wide study, along with a parallel study by Dr. Doron Behar, published in Nature the same month, examined the DNA of Ashkenazi Jews and compared it directly against Central Asian and Turkic populations. The conclusion was clear and direct. The genetic data is, and I am quoting the research, inconsistent with the Khazar hypothesis. Ashkenazi Jews do not cluster genetically with Turkic or Central Asian populations. They cluster with Middle Eastern populations. Their genome points, unmistakably, to the ancient Levant. Dr. Z. Oster stated publicly, I would hope that these observations would put the idea that Jewishness is just a cultural construct to rest. The Khazar theory, built over decades, was dismantled by DNA in a single study. But here is where the story gets more complicated, because while the paternal Y chromosome of Ashkenazi Jews pointed firmly to the Middle East, the maternal DNA told a slightly different story, one that led scientists to 4 women, 4 nameless women. Beer, whose DNA now lives inside tens of millions of people alive today. In 2006, Dr. Doron Behar and his supervisor, Professor Karl Skorecki of the Technion Israel Institute of Technology in Haifa, Israel, published a study in the American Journal of Human Genetics. They compared DNA from nearly 2,000 Jewish individuals against 11,500 non-Jewish people from 67 global populations. They were specifically looking at mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material that passes only through mothers, from mother to daughter to granddaughter, in an unbroken chain that never mixes with paternal DNA. What they found was remarkable. Approximately 40% of all Ashkenazi Jews trace their entire maternal lineage back to just 4 founding women. 4 women. That is it. We do not know their names. We do not know what they looked like. We do not know exactly when or where they lived. But Professor Karl Skorecki said this about them. The 4 founding mothers are from lineages that originate long before the launching of the Jewish people, some 3,400 years ago. They probably came from a large Middle Eastern gene pool. And a more recent 2025 study, published in Science Direct, using updated DNA analysis methods, confirmed that these 4 maternal lineages trace back to the ancient Near East, not Europe, as some earlier researchers had suggested. When the maternal story and the paternal story were finally aligned, both pointed to the same ancient origin. But here is the question that was still unanswered. If all major Jewish populations share this Levantine genetic core, what happens to the communities that formed outside the main diaspora, communities that had no contact with Europe or the Middle East for 2,000 years? The answer to that question was sitting in the highlands of Ethiopia, and it was about to shake the entire scientific world. Or in the mountains of Ethiopia, there is a community called the Beta Israel. They are Jewish, but their Judaism looks like nothing practiced anywhere else on earth today. They do not celebrate Hanukkah. They have never read the Talmud. They practice animal sacrifice, a ritual that mainstream Judaism stopped 2,000 years ago. Their prayers do not use the Hebrew liturgy developed in the diaspora, but instead, their entire religious practice looks like a photograph of ancient Israelite religion taken before the diaspora reshaped everything, a living, breathing museum of a faith that the rest of the Jewish world moved on from millennia ago. When geneticists tested their DNA, the results were both surprising and profound. The Beta Israel carry predominantly African, specifically Ethiopian, ancestry in their autosomal genome, minimal Middle Eastern DNA. And yet, a significant number of Beta Israel males carry something extraordinary in their Y chromosome. The Cohen modal haplotype, a specific genetic marker associated with the ancient Jewish priestly lineage. A marker traced genetically to the Kohanim, the priestly descendants of Aaron, brother of the prophet Musa, peace be upon him. And here is the detail that stopped researchers in their tracks. The Beta Israel version of this marker contains unique mutations not found in any other Jewish population on Earth, mutations that take thousands of years to develop, meaning their priestly lineage separated from the main Jewish population earlier than any other known diaspora community in the world. Dr. E. Harry Osterer noted that Beta Israel represent a case where, quote, Jewish identity successfully transmitted itself across a genetic barrier, religion, culture, practice, memory, all of it crossed into a completely different genetic population and held together for 2,000 years. In 1984 and 1991, the Israeli government launched 2 secret operations, Operation Moses and Operation Solomon, airlifting over 22,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel. By DNA, science and religious law were used together to determine who qualified. The decisions were painful, the debates were sharp, but the flights happened, and the Beta Israel came home, to a country most of them had never seen, because both their tradition and their DNA said they belonged there. Now, if Ethiopia showed that Jewish identity could survive without Levantine DNA, what happens when a handful of Jewish men survive a shipwreck 2,000 miles away out in India, and their male descendants are still genetically traceable today? On the western coast of India, in the state of Maharashtra, there is a Jewish community called the Bene Israel. Their origin story is simple. Around 2,000 years ago, 7 Jewish families were on a ship. The ship sank off the Indian coast. They survived. And they settled. They married local women. They maintained Jewish observances, Sabbath, dietary laws, prayers, for 2,000 years, in complete isolation from the rest of the Jewish world. For a long time, historians treated this as folklore. Then, in 2016, a team of scientists decided to test it. The team included Professor Eitan Friedman of Tel Aviv University in Israel, Professor Alon Kanan of Cornell University in the USA, and Professor Gil Atzman of Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York. They conducted a genome-wide analysis of 18 Bene Israel individuals, published in the journal PLOS One in 2016. Their conclusion: the Bene Israel are a genetically distinct population in India, with substantial Jewish ancestry alongside substantial Indian ancestry. But here is the detail that confirmed the oral tradition almost exactly. The admixture was sex-biased. The Y chromosome, passed only through fathers, showed clear Middle Eastern Levantine markers consistent with ancient Jewish origin. The mitochondrial DNA, passed only through mothers, was almost entirely South Asian, Jewish men, Indian women, a shipwreck story confirmed by a chromosome. The researchers stated, the genetic contribution of each of these ancestral populations is substantial, meaning both the Jewish and Indian sides of the family tree are real, measurable, and traceable. Wow. And then there is the second Indian Jewish community, the B'nai Menashe of northeastern India, who claim descent from the lost tribe of Manasseh. Their DNA shows predominantly East Asian ancestry, no clear Middle Eastern signal. Yet in 2005, Israel's Sephardic chief rabbi recognized them as a lost tribe. Thousands emigrated to Israel. The state chose tradition over genetics, and that, right there, is the question at the heart of this entire story. Is Jewish identity written in the DNA, or is it written in the memory? Because the final piece of this puzzle, the one that ties every community together, is a signal so consistent, so precise, that it appears in every Jewish population on Earth, regardless of continent, regardless of skin color, regardless of language. And when scientists found it, they realized the Jewish genome is not just a record of survival. It is the most extraordinary genetic time capsule in all of human history. Pull every thread back together. Ashkenazi Jews in Poland, Sephardic Jews in Morocco, Mizrahi Jews in Iraq, Beta Israel in Ethiopia, Bene Israel in India. 5 communities, 5 continents, thousands of years apart. One finding, consistent across every independent study ever conducted. Every Jewish population, regardless of where they live, shows a measurable genetic connection to the ancient Levant that their non-Jewish neighbors living in the same cities, the same streets, the same neighborhoods for centuries simply do not have. The Behar et al. 2010. Nature Study, the largest genome-wide analysis of Jewish populations ever published at that time, found that all major Jewish communities form a remarkably tight subcluster with common genetic origin, tighter than any comparable diaspora population in human history. Dr. So Harry Oster summarized it this way: the study supports the idea of a Jewish people linked by a shared genetic history. And then came the 2022 discovery from Erfurt, Germany, which added one final haunting layer to this story. Professor David Reich of Harvard noted that the medieval Jewish community buried in that cemetery had an intermarriage rate with outside populations of less than 1 in 500 per generation, over 25 generations, in medieval Europe. On that level of separation, during the most chaotic and violent centuries in European history, is not an accident. It is the result of a people who understood, consciously or not, that their identity lived in their blood, and that blood had to be protected. Professor Neil Risch of UCSF confirmed that certain genetic mutations have traveled through the Jewish population for approximately 120 generations, around the time the Jewish people formed as a distinct population in the Middle East. 120 generations. That is a living genetic thread stretching from the ancient Levant, all the way to a DNA test you can order online today. And here is what that means for the world right now. As millions of people take commercial DNA tests, Jewish families across every continent are opening 3,000-year-old archives. They are finding hidden family branches. They are discovering ancestors who publicly converted during the Spanish Inquisition, but secretly kept their identity for generations. They are finding cousins they never knew existed, in countries they have never visited. The genome is remembering what history tried to bury. Every secret conversion, every erased family name, every identity hidden to survive a massacre. The DNA kept the record, and now people are reading it. But there is one community whose story has barely been told, hidden across southern Spain and Portugal, families who converted to Christianity in 1492, publicly, officially, permanently, who attended church every Sunday, who gave their children Christian names, and who, behind closed doors, lit candles on Friday night, said Hebrew prayers in silence, and passed the secret to their children. For 500 years, they were called the Conversos, and their DNA was recently decoded. What scientists found inside those genomes does not just rewrite Jewish history, it rewrites the genetic history of modern Europe itself. That is the next episode.